All right, so welcome to the deep dive. We do things a little bit differently here. We take, well, let's be honest, sometimes a pretty intimidating pile of information and really boil it down to what you actually need to know. And we try to make it interesting along the way, something that hopefully makes you think.
Mm-hmm.
And today's stack is pretty hefty.
It really is.
We're diving into Steve Saylor Noticing, an essential reader, 1973-2023. This is decades of his observations on just a huge range of topics.
Yeah, he's been at it a while.
Oh, yeah. And I'm excited to get into it because, I am a fan of Steve Saylor.
Me too. He's one of the most interesting, I don't know what you call them, social commentators.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely a social commentator, but he's got this really data-driven way of looking at things.
It's not just opinion, right? He's actually looking at numbers, he's looking at history, he's looking at patterns.
Which is why I think it's such a good fit for the deep dive. Because our whole mission is to cut through the noise, right? And get to the heart of these big ideas that are shaping the world. And with Saylor, the range of topics is vast. We're talking everything from immigration.
Which is always a hot button issue.
Always. To how we understand human differences, which is, let's be honest, a minefield these days.
Oh, yeah. You could get a lot of trouble talking about that.
Exactly. But we're going to do it anyway. Because I think it's important. And because Steve Saylor does it in a way that's, I think, really valuable. It's thought-provoking, even if you don't always agree with him.
And I think that's the key. He makes you think. He forces you to look at things from a different angle.
Absolutely. So should we jump in?
Let's do it.
All right. So right off the bat, one of the core concepts in the book is this idea of citizenism.
Citizenism,
Yeah, and it sounds kind of basic, right? It's basically the idea that you should prioritize the interests of the citizens of your country.
Which, on the surface, sounds pretty reasonable.
It does. It sounds very American, right? Like that's what we're supposed to be about.
Take care of your own people first.
Exactly. But the book goes deeper than that because it links this idea of citizenism to what it calls kind of this American inherent idealism. Like we as Americans, we really want to believe we're doing the right thing.
There's that optimism, that can-do spirit.
Yes. But it also suggests that this idealism can be almost like a blind spot.
Yeah.
Like we can be so focused on doing good, on helping others, that we sometimes miss the bigger picture. And the book uses immigration as a prime example of this.
Which makes sense. Because immigration is one of those issues where there's a real disconnect between what the public thinks and what a lot of the elite, the policymakers, seem to be pushing for.
Yes. And the book has the data to back that up. It cites a poll from way back in 2002, this is pre-9/11 even, where a solid majority of Americans, like 60%, saw the current level of immigration as a major threat to the country.
Wow, 60%, that's a lot.
It is. But then it gets even more interesting because the book contrasts that with the views of what it calls prominent Americans.
Mm-hmm.
The politicians, the media figures, the academics.
The people who shape the conversation.
Exactly. And among those folks, the percentage who saw immigration as a critical threat, only 14%. So you have this massive gap between what the average person on the street is thinking and what the elite are saying.
So the question becomes, why? Why this huge disconnect?
Right. And the book offers several possible explanations. Some of them, I think, are going to be uncomfortable for some people to hear because it gets into like self-interest, who benefits from high levels of immigration.
Right, because someone's benefiting, otherwise it wouldn't be happening.
Exactly. And the book lays out the case. It talks about corporations, big businesses wanting a steady supply of cheap labor.
Makes sense, right? Lower labor costs equal higher profits.
Right. And then it talks about upper middle class families, professionals wanting access to affordable household help, nannies, cleaners, that sort of thing.
Right, because those are the folks who can actually afford that.
Exactly. And then you have the political angle. The book argues that for the Democratic Party, high levels of immigration, particularly from certain parts of the world, represent a potential path to more voters.
So there's a political incentive to keep those borders relatively open.
Exactly. And then it even gets into this idea of a whole industry, a whole sector built around ethnic activism.
Yeah.
Organizations, nonprofits that have a vested interest in maintaining a certain level of immigration.
So it's like a whole ecosystem that's grown up around this issue?
It is. And the book is saying, look, all these groups, they have their reasons, their motivations for supporting high levels of immigration. And it's not always about altruism.
It's about power. It's about money. It's about influence.
Exactly. And then the book points to another tactic that's used to kind of shut down the conversation. It talks about how anyone who favors tighter immigration controls, who's worried about the impact of mass immigration is often dismissed as, like, unsophisticated. Like, they just don't get it.
Right, like they're just simple-minded or something.
Exactly. The implication being that anyone who's truly intelligent, anyone who's truly informed, wouldn't worry about these things.
But that seems like a pretty convenient way to avoid actually engaging with the arguments, right?
It is. And the book then throws in this, I think, really interesting observation. It points out that many of the same elites who are publicly advocating for open borders, for welcoming everyone, well, they tend to live in areas that are pretty insulated from high immigrant concentrations.
So it's like a do as I say, not as I do kind of situation.
Exactly. And the book is saying, look, maybe this isn't about superior thinking. Maybe it's about something a little less noble. Maybe it's about wanting the benefits of cheap labor and diversity without having to deal with the potential downsides on a personal level.
So it's raising questions about hypocrisy, about whether these people actually believe what they're saying.
Right. And for you, the listener, it's a reminder to pay attention to not just what people say, but also what they do. Actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely. And look, this whole conversation about immigration, it often gets tangled up with discussions of race and national identity.
Oh, absolutely.
And the book does a good job, I think, of teasing those apart, because it specifically addresses this question of white nationalism.
Right, because that's the accusation that's often thrown around, right? That anyone who's concerned about immigration is secretly a white nationalist.
Exactly. But the book pushes back on that, and it does it in a way that I think is really interesting, because it argues that core American values, things like individualism, the idea of a meritocracy, where you succeed based on your own talent and effort.
The American dream.
Right, exactly. The book argues that these values are actually reasons why white Americans, by and large, aren't drawn to this kind of racial or ethnic favoritism that you see in white nationalism.
So it's saying that white Americans, because of these deeply ingrained American values, aren't actually that interested in creating a racial spoils system or a racial hierarchy.
Right. They're more focused on individual achievement within a system that they see as fair, or at least striving to be fair.
And that's a really important distinction, I think, because it challenges this narrative that's become so common that any concern about demographic change is automatically racist.
It's saying, look, maybe there are other reasons why people might be concerned about immigration, reasons that have nothing to do with white supremacy.
Right. Like, for example, the book talks about the potential economic consequences of unmanaged immigration. It argues that when you have a large influx of low-skilled labor, it can actually drive down wages for everyone at the bottom.
Which is bad for American workers, regardless of their race.
Exactly. And then it also talks about the impact on housing costs. When you have more people competing for a limited supply of housing, prices go up.
Basic economics.
Right. And the book even uses California as an example of this, which, for our listeners in California, I'm sure this resonates.
Oh, yeah. Housing costs here are astronomical.
They are. And the book is saying, look, part of that is driven by the sheer number of people coming into the state. And it's not just a California issue. This is something that's happening across the country, anywhere you have high levels of immigration.
So the book is making the case that unmanaged immigration can actually lead to the kind of inequality that we see in other parts of the world, like Latin America.
Exactly. And then, to give us some historical perspective, the book goes all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, founding fathers territory.
Wow, Benjamin Franklin, that's going way back.
It is. But it's fascinating because even back then, in 1751, Franklin was already writing about the potential downsides of unrestricted immigration. He was worried about population density, about how it affects wages, and the availability of land.
And you have to remember, at that time, America was still a relatively empty country. So for him to be worried about this, it's pretty remarkable.
It is. And he was actually drawing comparisons between Europe, which was already pretty crowded, and America, which was this vast open space.
So it wasn't just about xenophobia or something. He was thinking about the practical economic consequences.
Right. And what's really interesting is that the book then explains why Franklin's views on immigration seemed to change later in his life. And it comes down to basically westward expansion.
The idea of manifest destiny, America spreading across the continent.
Exactly. The book argues that once the possibility of westward expansion became real, once America started invading the world, as the book puts it, in terms of territory, well, the need to strictly limit immigration didn't seem as urgent because there was all this land to populate.
So it's like The pressure valve was released.
Yes. And that's a really important point, I think, because it shows how immigration is not just this abstract issue. It's tied to very concrete things like land, resources, and economic opportunity.
It's about carrying capacity. How many people can a given area actually support?
Exactly. And then just to touch on one more thing before we move on, the book has this little section about homesickness.
Homesickness. Okay, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, and it's not what you think. It's not about missing your mom's cooking. It's about the negative way society often views people who express a strong attachment to their neighborhoods, especially if those neighborhoods are changing demographically.
So it's about people feeling like their communities are being transformed in ways that they don't necessarily welcome.
Exactly. And the book is saying that this kind of sentiment is often dismissed or even pathologized as some kind of irrational fear or prejudice.
But isn't it natural to feel attached to the place where you live, where you've put down roots?
It is. But the book is saying that this is one of those areas where, depending on who's expressing that sentiment, it gets labeled very differently.
So it's about power dynamics again. Who gets to define what's acceptable to feel or to say?
Exactly. And for you, the listener, it's something to think about. How do we talk about community, about change, about belonging? These are complex issues. And I think the book does a good job of raising some uncomfortable questions.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some of the easy answers that we often hear.
Okay, so moving on. The next big theme the book tackles is this idea of invade the world, invite the world.
Invade the world, invite the world. Okay, that's a catchy title. What's that all about?
Well, it's about this idea that American foreign policy, especially in recent decades, has been characterized by both military interventionism abroad and a relatively open-door policy on immigration at home.
So it's like we're projecting power outward while simultaneously opening ourselves up to influences from the outside.
Exactly. And the book is saying that these two things are not unrelated. They're two sides of the same coin.
Interesting. And what kind of examples does the book use to illustrate this?
Well, it starts with Afghanistan, which, is particularly relevant given the whole 20-year war and the chaotic withdrawal.
Yeah, that was a mess.
It was. And the book, surprisingly, brings in Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King.
Kipling, wow, that's going back a ways.
It is. But the book makes the case that Kipling, even though he was, a very much an imperialist writer, he didn't have any illusions about the nature of empire.
He understood the risks, the potential for things to go wrong.
Yes. And the book contrasts that with John Huston's film adaptation, which came out in 1975, right after the Vietnam War.
So a very different historical context.
Exactly. And the film, according to the book, has this kind of post-Vietnam moral to it, where the main character, this kind of rogue adventurer, he ends up being both ennobled and destroyed by his responsibility for the people he's trying to help.
So it's a cautionary tale about the burdens of empire.
Exactly. And I think for our listeners, especially those who maybe weren't around for Vietnam or the early days of the Afghanistan war, it's a reminder that foreign policy has consequences. It's not just some abstract game played by politicians in Washington. It affects real people's lives.
And it can have unintended consequences, too.
Oh, absolutely. And then the book gets into something that I think a lot of people might not be aware of. It talks about cousin marriage.
Cousin marriage. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah. And it's not just like a quirky cultural practice. The book points out that cousin marriage is actually really common in certain parts of the world, especially North Africa, West Asia, places like Pakistan, India.
So we're talking about significant populations here.
Yes. And the book argues that this practice can have some pretty profound effects on society because it leads to, strong family loyalties, but it can also lead to inbreeding.
Which, from a biological perspective can have some downsides.
Right. And the book argues that this kind of, inward-looking focus on the family, it can make it harder to build a broader civil society.
So it's like trust doesn't extend beyond the immediate family.
Exactly. And the book uses Iraq as an example, which, is another country that we've been heavily involved in militarily.
Right. And where we've struggled to, establish a stable, functioning democracy.
Right. And the book is saying that part of the reason for that might be these deeply ingrained tribal and clan structures that are, in part, rooted in cousin marriage.
So it's like we went in there trying to impose our model of democracy without fully understanding the underlying social dynamics.
Exactly. And then the book highlights this really stark contrast between American society, where inbreeding is, taboo.
Yeah, we have laws against it.
Right. And these other cultures where it's accepted, even encouraged. And this becomes really relevant when the book talks about family reunification laws in Europe.
Okay, how so?
Well, the book argues that these laws, which are intended to, allow families to stay together, can sometimes be exploited through arranged cousin marriages.
So people are using these marriages to get around immigration restrictions.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, it raises questions about how different cultures interact with Western laws and systems.
It's like a clash of civilizations almost.
It is. And then the book steps back and asks this really big question. What were the real motivations behind American foreign policy after 9/11? Was it all about, spreading democracy, fighting terrorism, helping people?
Or was there something else going on?
Right. And the book doesn't offer a simple answer, but it does introduce some pretty thought-provoking perspectives.
Like what?
Well, it mentions Gregory Cochrane, who has this kind of blunt view that he calls the idiocracy perspective.
The idiocracy perspective. Okay, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's based on that movie where the world gets dumber and dumber over time.
Right, I remember that one. It was kind of a cult classic.
It was. And Cochrane, he's basically saying that maybe American foreign policy isn't always driven by some grand strategic plan. Maybe it's just driven by incompetence.
So not malice, but just a lack of understanding, a lack of competence.
Exactly. And it's a scary thought, right? Because if the people who are making these decisions, if they don't really understand the consequences of their actions, well, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's like the blind leading the blind.
Right. And then the book even digs into some of the pre-9/11 thinking about invading Iraq.
This is the whole, weapons of mass destruction thing.
Right. And the book references Mickey Herskovitz, who was, I guess, kind of a friend of George W. Bush's. And he claims that Bush had this desire to be seen as a strong commander-in-chief.
So it's about legacy, about proving himself.
Right. And Herskovitz even claims that Bush felt like his dad, George H.W. Bush, had wasted political capital after the first Gulf War by not going all the way to Baghdad.
So it's like a family drama playing out on the world stage.
It is. And the book is saying, look, these are the kinds of personal and political motivations that can sometimes shape major foreign policy decisions.
It's not always about, rational strategic calculations. It's about human emotions, about ego.
Right. And then the book, just to kind of poke fun at this whole anti-borders ideology, it introduces this concept of the Zeroth Amendment.
The Zeroth Amendment. Okay, I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's not a real amendment. It's just this idea, this tongue-in-cheek concept that there should be a constitutional right to move across borders freely.
So, no borders, no restrictions on movement.
Exactly. And the book uses this to kind of satirize what it sees as a growing zealotry around this whole open borders idea.
So it's saying that for some people, this has become almost like a religious belief.
It has. And the book even quotes Bill Clinton, way back in 1999, saying that he believes in the ultimate wisdom of a borderless world.
Wow, Bill Clinton said that.
He did. And the book is saying, look, this is the kind of thinking that's been gaining ground among certain elites, certain influential groups.
But why? What's in it for them?
Well, the book delves into that.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about how certain groups, like billionaires, for example.
Is super rich.
Yes, they benefit from, a globalized, interconnected world. They benefit from being able to move money and people across borders easily.
So it's about economic freedom for them, but maybe not so much for everyone else.
Right. And then it also talks about the Democratic Party again, and how for them, a more diverse electorate, an electorate that's less tied to traditional American values, might be politically beneficial.
So it's about shifting the demographics to their advantage.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then the book points to a really disturbing trend that I think we've all seen happening. This increasing self-censorship, this fear of speaking out against mass immigration.
Yeah, because you can get labeled a racist really quickly these days.
You can. And the book uses the example of this band, Dream Machine, who reportedly lost their record label after one of the members spoke out against mass immigration.
So there are real consequences for expressing these views.
There are. And then the book cites this international survey by Kaufman, which looked at attitudes towards immigration around the world. And guess what? The U.S. stood out as the most fanatic, as the book puts it, in condemning any kind of intelligent immigration policy as racist.
So we're the most extreme on this issue, even compared to other Western countries.
According to the survey, yes.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, pretty surprising for a lot of people.
It is. It goes against this narrative that we're this, beacon of tolerance and diversity.
Right. And then just to add another layer of complexity to this whole thing, the book brings up the Gulen movement.
The Gulen movement. I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's this Turkish religious movement that's been accused of having a hidden agenda. And one of the things they do is they run charter schools.
Charter schools here in the U.S.
Yes, and the book raises questions about what they're really up to. Are they just trying to provide good education, or is there something else going on?
That's a little suspicious.
It does. And the book even points to allegations that they've been caught giving their students test answers in advance.
So it's about cheating the system, getting ahead by any means necessary.
Right. And the book draws parallels between Gulen and these other, kind of cult-like figures, like L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology.
Right. Scientology, that's a whole other rabbit hole.
It is. And Werner Erhard, who founded ADEST. These are all figures who, they have this kind of grandiose view of themselves, this idea that they're special, that they have the answers.
So it's about power, about influence, about control.
It is. And the book then makes this, I think, really ironic observation. It says that despite being, the imperial capital of the world, America often seems to lack the kind of strategic cunning that you'd expect from a great empire.
So we're powerful, but maybe not so smart about how we use that power.
Exactly. And then the book connects all of this to the 2020 presidential election, which, was obviously a very contentious election.
To say the least.
Right. And the book argues that at the heart of all the conflict, at the heart of all the division, was this fundamental question. Do white Americans have a right to have a say in who immigrates to their country, especially from countries that are majority black or Muslim?
So it's about demographics, about power, about who gets to control the future of the country.
Exactly. And the book points to the brouhaha, as it calls it, over Trump's comments about Norway and Haiti.
Right, when he said he'd rather have immigrants from Norway than from Haiti.
Exactly. And the book is saying that this kind of reaction, this immediate labeling of any dissenting view as racist, it's a way to shut down the conversation, to avoid actually engaging with the arguments.
Like, if you don't agree with me, you're a bad person.
Right. And then it talks about Nancy Pelosi's response to Ilhan Omar's comments about Jewish donors.
Right, when Omar said that U.S. support for Israel was all about the Benjamins.
Exactly. And Pelosi, instead of, condemning anti-Semitism, she kind of shifted the blame to white Christian Americans.
So it's like, even when there's clear evidence of bigotry, the focus is still on blaming white people.
It is. And then, just to wrap up this whole invade the world, invite the world theme, the book takes a look at demographic trends in Africa.
Africa. Okay. That's a whole other can of worms.
It is. And the book uses Tanzania as an example. Their population is growing incredibly fast.
Right. Africa has the highest birth rates in the world.
It does. And the book is saying that this is going to have massive implications for the future of global migration.
Because if those populations continue to grow, and if those countries can't provide economic opportunities for all those people, well, they're going to go somewhere else.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, it's something to think about. What's the long-term impact of these demographic shifts going to be?
It's a question we're all going to have to grapple with.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what the book calls the sailor strategy.
The sailor strategy. Okay. What's the strategy?
Well, it's a political strategy. And it's specifically aimed at the Republican Party. And it's based on this really simple idea. The Republican Party could gain more by increasing its share of the white vote, even by a small amount, than it could by drastically increasing its share of minority votes.
So it's a numbers game.
It is. It's about understanding the demographics of the electorate. And the book uses the 2000 election as the prime example.
Right. That was the Bush-Gore election, the one that went down to the wire.
Exactly. And the book points out that even if Bush had not lost any white votes, his overall margin of victory would have been pretty much the same.
So the white vote was crucial.
It was. And the book then identifies this kind of missed opportunity for the Republican Party. It talks about the large segment of white Union families who ended up voting for Gore.
So these are traditionally Democratic voters.
They are. But the book is saying that if the Republican Party had managed to swing even a small percentage of those voters, it would have had a much bigger impact than trying to make huge inroads with Hispanic voters.
Which was the more fashionable strategy at the time, right?
Exactly. But the book argues that it was a less mathematically sound strategy, because even if you manage to win over a large percentage of a small group, it might not be enough to offset losses in a larger group.
It's about focusing on the right battleground, the place where you can actually make a difference.
Exactly. So the sailor strategy is all about, appealing to white voters, particularly working-class white voters, who might be open to a more conservative message.
And it's a strategy that, looking back, seems to have worked for Trump in 2016.
It did. He won over a lot of those white working-class voters who had traditionally voted Democrat. So the book is saying, look, this is a path to victory for the Republican Party. Whether they choose to take it is another question.
But it's definitely a strategy worth considering.
All right, let's move on to a section that I think is going to be particularly interesting and maybe a little controversial. It's called Villains and Heroes.
Villains and heroes. Okay, I'm ready for some drama. Who are the villains? Who are the heroes? And why?
Well, the book starts with a figure who's often seen as hero on the left, Michel Foucault.
Foucault, yeah. He's a big name in academia, in postmodern thought.
He is. But the book asks this really interesting question. Did Foucault himself actually believe the conclusions that his followers have drawn from his work?
So it's like, is he responsible for the way his ideas have been used?
Right, because Foucault, he wrote a lot about power, about social norms, about how these things are constructed, and his work has been incredibly influential in the development of identity politics.
Right, the idea that everything is about power dynamics, about who's oppressing whom.
Exactly. But the book is saying that maybe Foucault himself wouldn't necessarily agree with the way his ideas are being used today.
So it's like his legacy has taken on a life of its own.
It has. And then the book points to a real tension that you see in a lot of these debates, this tension between social constructionism and identity politics.
Right, because on the one hand, you have this idea that race is a social construct, that it's not real. And on the other hand, you have identity politics, which is all about, racial identity, racial solidarity.
Exactly. And the book uses the example of the movement to celebrate natural black hair.
Okay, I can see how that fits in.
Right, because on the one hand, it's about rejecting Eurocentric beauty standards, but on the other hand, it's still defining people based on race.
So it's like, are you rejecting the category or are you embracing it?
Right, and the book is saying that this is a contradiction that runs through a lot of these discussions.
It's a bit of a head scratcher.
It is. And then the book brings up this really controversial aspect of Foucault's thought. It mentions a radio interview he did in 1978 where he argued for abolishing age of consent laws.
Wow, abolishing age of consent laws, that's pretty extreme.
It is, and the book is using this to show how Foucault's ideas about power and social norms, if taken to their logical extreme, can lead to some pretty disturbing conclusions.
So it's a warning about